email? What does it mean?
Communication is the imparting or exchanging of information or news.
The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Conversation is the oral exchange of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas.
Forbes Books Radio presents The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett.
Welcome back to part 2 of my discussion with Amy Sandler, principal coach and podcast host at Radical Candor. We pick up the conversation with an example from the book Radical Candor by Kim Scott and a question for Amy about how we can be better at giving and receiving tough feedback.
Kim talks about in the book, she had a meeting with somebody on her team, and I think in 30-minute conversation, he kept mixing up two countries, Slovakia and Slovenia, and finally she just said, "It's Slovakia, dumbass." And that's like, I would never take that well. That would, I mean, even, unless she was laughing when she said it or something, that would not land well with me and my personality. So taking that, how does one develop the skills to give, if they're uncomfortable giving feedback, what can they do to get better at it? And if you're uncomfortable, like I am, receiving this perceived negative feedback, how do you get better at it?
Well, I'm with you. I wouldn't want to be called dumbass. And I think the big thing with Kim and the story is like these sort of dimensions of radical candor have lengths to them. So based on your relationship, there might be someone, I might have a shorthand with them and I can say, "Dude, it's Slovakia." I might be able to say that to them. That would be radical candor, but for someone else, it might not land that way.
Right.
And, I think I will often share the difference between me and Kim and maybe you too. Again, it's people are going to look very different. So the other response you might get when someone is giving you criticism, rather than an emotional response, even more likely you might get sort of no response at all. Like the person might be shutting down. And we don't really know what's happening here. Maybe they don't agree with you. Maybe you weren't being clear. Maybe they are embarrassed, or maybe they don't know how to fix it. Maybe they just got a text message and it's like something from their spouse, right? They have a family issue. So in that case, when we talk about moving further out on challenge directly, someone like Kim, who would self-identify, she's a bit more stubborn. She tells the story in the book where she just had this big meeting and she was running Google ads and the business was going like crazy. And the team was, the CEO was like, "What do you need? More people, more money? What do you need?" So she's thinking this was the greatest meeting in the world. And her boss says, "Kim, you said a lot in that meeting." And Kim brushes it off. "Oh, it's not a big deal. And then we'll get you a speech coach." I'm too busy for a speech coach. And Kim kept brushing it off. "Not a big deal, not a big deal," very stubborn, until finally her boss said, "Kim, I can see that you're not hearing me. When you say every third word, it makes you sound stupid." Wow. Now this person, her boss, had Kim's attention. Just to your point.
Now it landed.
Yeah, that would have been obnoxious aggression, but that we would never have gotten there. For Kim, that was radical candor. If my boss said, "Amy, you said every third word," I would have been mortified. I would have said, "This is a disaster. This is terrible. Oh, it's okay. We'll get you a speech coach." "Oh, speech coach, great." I'm not saying one is better than the other. We're all different, but Kim needed to be challenged there. Somebody, radical candor is going to look different for somebody working with me versus somebody like working with you, et cetera. So that's just kind of thing one. And so if I'm working with someone who's more like me, maybe a little bit like you, I like to say, "Amy, I know how hard you worked on this presentation and it shows. This presentation could be even better if you started with the last slide. Having that slide at the end, you lost the audience. So start with the last slide first. You're going to really get so much more of that engagement that you're looking for, right? So, acknowledging, you can bring the care in, acknowledging how hard the person worked. Kim doesn't necessarily need that. She's like, just get right to the point. So I want to distinguish between that and the feedback sandwich, because that's a mistake that a lot of people make. Do you know what the feedback sandwich is? Or should I explain it?
I think so, but go ahead and tell us.
Yeah. So this was something that was taught in years gone by, where you sort of shove a piece of criticism in between two pieces of praise. Like, "Oh, Amy, great glasses, terrible presentation, but I love the font. Like you're just you're like throwing it all in and you're just hoping that I'll get something out of it. It's not clear. Our goal is that we are having more frequent conversation. This isn't just like an annual root canal. This is not an annual performance management conversation. Practicing radical candor is about ongoing development conversations. This is much more about praise than about criticism. So by the time you get to something more formal, you're not surprised. So that's one thing. That's in the giving of it. Like, I think the giving of it, it's helpful to know, like, what is the most effective way for this person to hear it? Like, because we want it to land. So I like to use that context, observation, result, expected, next step. Now, we can say it in a way where we're sort of taking it out of judgments. We're not saying, Amy, you're an idiot. We're not saying, Amy, you're a genius. I might still hear it that way, right? But if I can tell that you're doing this to be helpful, to help me succeed, like eventually I'll get to the, oh, okay, I see. Yeah, kind of stung a little bit, but I know this person was sharing this because they really did want to help me succeed.
What was this sandwich called?
Well, it's called the feedback sandwich. There is a less polite term
okay.
Called the shit sandwich, but I don't know the colorful language on your podcast.
No, it's all good.
Okay.
It's all good.
Yeah.
I had a speaking coach once who talked about, I guess her version would be an open face sandwich then, because she called it slap, slap, hug, hug. She would give you two bad things, slap, slap, and then she said, here's how we're going to make it better, and hug you and make it better. So, so I'm going to call that an open face sandwich.
That's funny. Yeah. I mean, ideally we're doing this often enough that we could just give one piece of praise. Like, hey, Clint, this worked so well in the podcast when you brought in your own stories. Like, that enabled me to like flesh out my ideas even further. Stories are great. Keep it up. Right. Like, that's specific and sincere praise. Like, and sometimes people think like, oh, I need to have given like 5 pieces of praise to 1 piece of criticism, or like 7 to 1. It's not a paint by numbers, but what matters is we really do want to focus on the good stuff. Like, this is what motivates people, but not when we're just like giving throwaway praise, like, oh, Amy, great website. Like, that is not helpful. Like, it's got to be specific and sincere. So put some effort into your praise. I think that people really fall short there.
I want to come back to core in a minute, but before I do, you were talking about giving feedback to your boss. And so let's say that I have a boss who doesn't know about Radical Candor and doesn't work there. And so, and I'm wondering, how can I give Radical Candor to my boss? Do I need to update my resume first? Do I need to give him a copy of Kim's book as a gift? How do I do that?
Well, that's really funny. Kim did tell a story like years ago when she got a question about like giving feedback to the boss, and then the person got fired. So I certainly, this is where, like, if there's any, please use Radical Candor with your own advice, like, the drug interactions, if you may cause severe allergies, rash, dizziness, etc. So I do not want to be, I don't want to be in that boat. I will say the order of operations holds, which is with anyone, start by asking for feedback. So I would start by asking my boss for feedback. Hey, I'm working on this. What's one way I could improve this? Or, hey, how can I be a better thought partner in our one-on-one meetings? Or, what's one way I could be more prepared for one-on-one meetings? Or, what's your top priority and how could I best support that, et cetera. So like asking your boss for feedback, that would be thing one. Specific and sincere praise. Now, not every, boss necessarily wants that. I know Kim, for example, can sometimes find that as flattery, but I so sort of know that person. But when you're highlighting like, oh, it worked really well. I thought it worked really well in the team meeting when you saved 5 minutes so that we could all kind of follow up each other with our open, so we had some space to actually like solicit feedback from each other. I really appreciate that you did that, right? So specific and sincere praise. And then what I like to do is I might kind of check and see, hey, I've got an idea that I think might help the team out, or I've made an observation about something that I think could help me and other folks on the team be more productive. Would you be open to hearing it, right? So kind of checking, seeing if they're open to it would be a good start.
Similar to Kim's story, then I had somebody on the podcast recently, and I don't want to say who it was because I don't want to get the wrong person, but anyway, he tells a story about being a consultant for a client, and he was like a coach for them and had a long relationship with them, and they were doing layoffs, and it's a medium, small size company, and he said, he made the comment, there's 5 of you on the exec team. I think we could probably do it with 1. And so the next day he was asked to leave. So he got fired. It may be a little bit too much candor there.
That might be veering into radical transparency, right? So, well, and I think if I'm understanding the conversation, was this done in a group?
It was just the executive team and him, but they were talking about different layoffs they were going to do and all these other things. And well, you need to save money. I think just one of you could be around instead of all five. We don't need 5 people in the C-suite. So.
Yeah, and I think look, that's a different. I would put that in a different category than like sort of radically candid feedback. That would almost be more about like strategic consulting and advice. And it actually brings up a story you might be familiar with Alan Mulally, who I'm a big fan of. He had been the CEO of Ford, and he tells this story, and I hope I can get it right. If not, we can find for your show notes. We referenced it in one of our Radical Candor podcasts. But when he came into Ford, they were losing tons of money, and he kept getting these report outs in his sort of C-suite, his reports meetings, and everything was, everything's going great. Greens all around. Like there was no culture where people could report failure. And so he basically said, he's like, there is a disconnect between this, like we can't be green and losing all this money. And so I really need to see where we're behind in a metric. And so someone finally came to the meeting and they put in like a yellow or a red, and he was like, yay. And like, so it was really about, and this actually goes with psychological safety, that people had not felt safe to have that conversation. And so that might be a little bit different than what your consultant was having, but like, how can we create in these, sort of larger group conversations? I think these one-on-one radically candid conversations are what Kim would call the atomic building block of sort of more healthy cultural debate, that we can talk about, gosh, like where are these inefficiencies happening?
Yeah, I think probably the first situation could have been handled maybe a little bit differently, in that maybe you shouldn't have been so brutally honest at the moment. Maybe there's a better way of saying it, right? Then 4 of you don't need to be here. But the other one is the story you just told, I think is important, because people want to tell the truth, but they're also afraid that you're going to shoot the messenger. So it's one thing if Alan comes in and says, okay, everything can't be green and yet we're, bleeding money, something is off. But until the first person was brave and did it and didn't get shot, then everybody says, okay, now we have the safety to come into this. But if he'd have reacted differently,
exactly,
that's always been green.
That's why it's such a great story. And even with your consultant who, could have been done a little differently, but like, these are the kinds of things, like we need to be able to have these kinds of conversations and look at the data thoughtfully. And there's really good content in the book that Kim talks about that's beyond feedback. She calls it the get stuff done or the get shit done wheel. But basically, like, how do we make these kinds of decisions? So if we were to make a decision about downsizing, listen, clarify, debate, decide. Very often people forget these different steps that we need to take when we are making a decision of how we're getting inputs. Does everyone feel like they were part of the debate? Is there a clear path for decision making? How are we going to implement it? How are we going to learn from it, et cetera? I'm sure you do that all the time in your project management.
You have to. Otherwise, you get, going back to the Alan Mulally story, I mean, you need, as a project manager, I tell people all the time, listen, I'm okay with the fact that things don't go right, because no plan goes as planned, right? I'm okay with the bad news. What I'm not okay with is bad news you've known about for weeks or months, hoping to fix before anybody found out. And now you're telling me 6 weeks ago, there were options I had on the table that we could have fixed this for a lower cost. Now it's going to cost a lot more money to fix it, or we have to go back to the customer saying we can't deliver now. But if you'd have told me early enough, we could have done something about it. So you have to create that situation where people aren't afraid to tell the truth.
100%. It's so well said. And I think that Alan Mulally story is just a classic of what good leadership looks like.
One of your podcasts I listened to, you're talking about the fundamental attribution error. And, it was context really matters. And you kind of had this parable about boats and meditating monks. So why don't you touch on that for a minute?
I'll see if I can remember that one. Yeah, it's like, we tend to put intentions on the other person versus ourselves. So if I am not giving Jason feedback because I don't want to hurt Jason's feelings, I know I'm a good person. My intent is I just don't want to hurt his feelings. So that might be ruinous empathy. But all Jason knows is that he's not getting the feedback. So it could land for him as manipulative insincerity. Like he doesn't know what's happening. And so it really sort of goes to this idea of intent versus impact. And I'm just fascinated by the stories we come up with in our minds, and especially working remote, we have a lot more time to make these stories. And so, yeah, the monk, there was a story like they're in a boat and they're having this very peaceful meditation, and then this other boat like smashes into them, and they're all ready to like yell at the person steering the boat, like, "Are you an idiot? Like, don't you know how to steer this boat?" You know, filled with rage. They just got cut off in traffic, right? We can relate. And then they look and there's nobody in the boat. And then they're like, "Oh, interesting." And it
Who am I going to yell at now?
you know, and I love that story because we're just so quick to go right to like, whose fault is it? You know, and the reason why you had brought up about like, we're so hard on ourselves, like when I've been practicing mindfulness for a really long time. And when you start getting really quiet with yourself, you start to realize the hardest critic is the self-critic. Like, to what you're saying, like, if I'm berating that boat, I'm very often also berating my own boat. You know, the fundamental attribution error would say, well, no, like, I'm driving the boat great. I would never smash into them, right? Everyone else is a bad driver. But I do think we tend to also judge ourselves, most of us, pretty harshly.
You know, it's funny. I totally agree with what you just said, because I'm my own worst critic. But there's a study that I like to talk about from 1997 by U.S. News and World Report, and they did a survey of people, and they said, and sometimes I don't want to bring this survey up because of the environment we live in today. But anyway, the question asked was, I'm going to give you a list of names, and I want you to tell me what chance you think this person has of getting into heaven. Now, I've done this at HR people. They don't like the word heaven. But anyway, it's getting into the afterlife, whatever you want to call this other place, it's maybe better, right? So they had a list of people, and this is 1997. So it was Princess Diana, Michael Jordan, Dennis Rodman, Oprah Winfrey, all these people, Bill and Hillary Clinton. And so I think the worst score on the worst percentage was Dennis Rodman. I think he was down around 37%, right? Bad boy from Detroit. And then Michael Jordan was higher than that. I think Bill Clinton got 55% and Hillary got 60 because she got an extra 5% for putting up with Bill, you know, kind of thing. And then Oprah Winfrey was the highest scoring person on the list at 68%, I think it was. When I like to joke, just proving you can buy your way into heaven because she was the richest person on the list. But then they said, okay, great. Now what about Mother Teresa? And so I'm thinking, all right, Mother Teresa, come on. That's by definition, you know. So it's got to be, you're not going to get 100 because people are tough, but it's got to be in the upper 90s, right? It turns out the answer was 78%. So a tough crowd. 78% said Mother Teresa had a chance of getting into heaven. There was one person that scored higher than that at 87%. And that was the person being surveyed. They gave themselves a better chance of getting into heaven than Mother Teresa. And so something you said triggered that to me, because the way I interpret that data is, why would I think that I have a better chance of getting into heaven than anybody else on the list? I think it's because I also measure myself off of my intentions.
Exactly.
As opposed to I measure you off of what you actually delivered.
Exactly. Yeah. That is quite profound. Yeah. It's this whole idea of intent versus impact. I know why I may or may not be saying it to that person. We will often do, in our workshops, we'll have people look at the framework and we'll ask them, okay, so when you're not practicing radical candor, which mistake do you make the most? And they depends on the organization, but typically the most mistakes we tend to see would be ruinous empathy, but with a mix of others. And then I will ask, so what mistake do you experience most at work? And invariably, I mean, sometimes this isn't the case, but we will see a lot more manipulative insincerity than ruinous empathy. And the reason for that is, and that's when I'll bring up the fundamental attribution error and this idea of intent versus impact. I know I didn't say the thing because of ruinous empathy, but all this person knows is they feel like everyone's talking about them behind their back. And, you know, we're sort of this whole intent versus impact. And I think it's a really important point. I like to say with intent versus impact, you know, you might not have meant to be standing on my foot, but you are standing on my foot. So please get off my foot. Like there's still an impact, right? Like I might not have meant it, but, I think we can give each other like sort of that assumed good intent, give each other the benefit of the doubt. But yeah, we know, and very often, Clint, when it comes to one of the reasons why I love Radical Candor too is because it's this very simple framework. But I think I mentioned like it requires us to do some deep work. Why did I not say the thing? Oh, I didn't want to hurt their feelings. Yes. And I would have to really look at myself like, I didn't really want to have that tough conversation, right? Like it does force us to really like hold the mirror up.
Yeah, because sometimes it might be something you could have done better too that maybe would have avoided the situation
100%.
or at least reduced it, right?
100%.
So I did want to come back to this concept of core that you mentioned earlier. And, you give, to help people give feedback that focuses on behavior and not personality, right? So, which is kind of what we're talking about. You have this tool called CORE. Can you explain, you mentioned what the CORE stands for, but can you explain it again and just kind of give an example of how it can be used?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, while we don't want to give people scripts, it is very helpful for people to have like mental models, like with the framework, like, oh, do I need to move up on care personally? Do I need to move out on challenge directly? Same thing with putting our feedback together. And this goes for both praise and criticism. So CORE, again, we adapted it from the Center for Creative Leadership, but it stands for context, observation, result, and expected next step. So in the story that I alluded to where Steve was my boss, and we just delivered this new website and he was giving me feedback how I was in the meeting, the context was, in the meeting, debriefing the website launch. Like that's all you don't have to spend a lot of time on context, but you want to make sure that you and that other person are on the same page. Observation, this is really important because very often when we're in these conversations, there might be some emotion or some extra flavor that we want to put into it. But this is where we're trying to take out the judgment. So the observation is either about what the person observed of your behavior or about the actual work product. So in this case, it was about my behavior. So in the meeting, what was observed? When you interrupted your team. Again, he's not saying you're a terrible person. I might hear it that way, but he's not. He's just saying when you interrupted your team. Now, the result, this is really where we have to give some thought because Radical Candor is not about nitpicking. Like any good relationship, you want to leave 3 or 4 unimportant things unsaid. So in this case, the most important result was you lost the respect of your team. Right. And it really forces you, like, do I know this person well enough to know what is going to be the most impactful result here? Maybe it's about the future of the project. Maybe it's about, the CEO is not going to give us the next project, et cetera. Like, so what is sort of the key result here? I like to think about the C, the O, and the R as the feedback, the thing that happened. Let's get alignment there. We were joking at the top about like the biggest mistake about communication is thinking that it happened, right? So often with these things, it's very clear in our mind because we have maybe had this conversation 100 times in our head, but this might be the first time this person is hearing it. So check for alignment. Like, does this person know? Do they agree? Oh, okay. Yeah, I know what you mean about when I was interrupting, or I have no idea. Like, give me another example. I didn't see it that way. I didn't see it as interrupted. Like, there might be a back and forth just to get agreement on the context, observation, and result. And by the way, if we have, just like we might have financial debt or technical debt, we might have feedback debt. Maybe we've been thinking about this for 3 months and they're like, I don't know what meeting you're talking about. Like, I can't even remember what I had for lunch yesterday, right? So get alignment there. Sometimes it might be really easy. Sometimes that might take actually a few conversations, right? And then we added this idea of an expected next step because we want this to be about development. Like, how can we grow? This is about an informal, more frequent conversation. So as an expected next step, Steve said, go check in on your team, apologize to them. Like, that was a clear next step. Sometimes I don't know what the solution is. Maybe I had some feedback. I said, Clint, the numbers on your podcast, I'm seeing a dip in listeners this past month. And then you say, oh, that's because we actually moved to a different platform. It's actually calibrated on a different thing. Oh, I wasn't aware of that. Okay, let me review the data. Let's meet next Tuesday and see where we are then, right? So like we've got a meeting, maybe there's some more work, but we do want to make sure that we're clear what we're doing from this conversation.
So if you are giving feedback and it lands wrong with the recipient, because it's like you said, it's not what I say, it's what hits their ears, and some damage is done with the relationship, what is the most human thing you can do as a leader to show up and make it right? Or is there anything?
100%. Yeah. I mean, I think there's like a bit of a mindset shift. Like these are about conversations and relationships, right? Like this is not a one-off, like we're probably going to mess up. Like, and we're going to and this is actually how we grow. And Clint, when I shared my perspective with you about the data, I'm aware I came in a little hot. I tend to do that. And I wanted to check in how it landed and how I could have communicated it more effectively for you. Right? Like, so you can own your piece of it, or you could say, I'm concerned I wasn't as clear as I needed to be. Can you let me know what you heard? And then you could share back and be like, and then, I need to get better at being more clear with you. Give me an example. Like, how would you have liked me to do it? Right. So kind of own it. It's an ongoing conversation, checking in. I will say, going back to feeling like how to actually be open to hearing this kind of feedback more. I got a note in Slack once. Jason, like I mentioned, is my boss. I've never had a better relationship with a boss. But I'm still very sensitive. And so I get this Slack. We usually have a weekly one-on-one. It was like, do you have time this week? I have some thoughts. Did you hear the murder music mystery in that Slack? Because I certainly did. I was like, I have some thoughts. It's like, oh my God. I was like, well, I had a good run at Radical Candor. It's been like a good 6 years. And so we met the next day. I actually use it as a chance to just sort of practice like, okay, I'm enough. I'm good enough. Like, it's okay. Like, Jay, and he checked in. He checked in with me. I was running a new project. He wanted to see how it was going. And then he had couple suggestions on some things I was struggling with that actually was very helpful. So then I said, Jason, this was such a great meeting. Also, Jason, never again. I have some thoughts. And he cracked up and he said it was so funny because he's like, I edited that message a few times. I was like, no, that was terrible. I said, next time, just say, hey, I would love to check in with you on this project. Because that's what he did, right? Like I just want, I want to see how you think it's going. Now, Kim might not have cared about I have some thoughts, but I'm going to turn I have some thoughts into terrible, terrible, terrible.
So I'm curious. We talk about this, and I do a lot of global projects, and I feel like there are places where candor is not acceptable in some cultures. They just will not say anything negative back to the boss. Do you find that, or you see that it actually plays out, or do you have to do something different based on culture?
Yeah, this is a big question. I think that, there's always going to be diversity around, individual one-on-one culture. Like the reason why I think Radical Candor can be so helpful is because it's really about one-on-one conversations. But of course, like we're sharing our perspective, and that is going to be influenced based on, our own, like our language, our, ethnicity, our culture, all of these different ways in which we're sort of getting these messages. And I certainly have worked in different cultures where either it's not acceptable for much more hierarchical environment where it would not be appropriate for me to give my boss criticism. And I did a workshop once, it was in Eastern Europe, and there was a culture where we just don't give praise. And so the team member literally wrote themselves a praise note because they weren't going to be getting it. So there's kind of only so much that you can do. But what I always, whether it's a difference around, generational difference, which I think is its own culture, I think it's very helpful for people to understand what it looks like in their own sort of words or in their own way. And one thing that Kim did, and she talks about this in the book, so you probably saw it. I think she had a team in Japan, she had a team in Israel. And so it's like, put Radical Candor into your own words. It's like the team in Japan, they called it polite persistence, because politeness, like that was a way of showing care, but they were still going to be persistent, but they were going to do it in a way that was very polite. So I think and when I've done this work with other cultures, I actually did a session with a group in Japan, a few months ago too, having folks put it like in their own words, give me examples. What does it look like? That's going to be the best way to kind of model what it can look like. So I can say it, but even more impactful would be, this could be a really fun exercise for somebody to do, like with their boss or with their team. Like, what does this idea of care personally and challenge directly look like for us individually? Maybe it means we arrive on time, we end 5 minutes early. What are those kind of signals of respect that we can do that we feel comfortable with?
Yeah, Japan is the culture I was thinking of, because I do a lot of work in Japan, and it's one of my favorite places in the world outside of the U.S. I would live there in a heartbeat. But what I've noticed is they do have a very polite culture, and they don't even want to say no. If they no to them is when they go, that will be difficult. That means it's never going to happen. But they don't tell you that. They say it'll be difficult, but that's their version of no. So
and I think again, like kind of distinguishing between these one-on-one kind of radically candid conversations and relationships we're building. And so we could say, if I was working with a new team member and I say, look, I know that it's going to be hard for you to say no. So I'm going to assume everything is a no unless you tell me yes, or you know what I mean? Like you can almost, even just playing with it a little bit in a way that both people feel comfortable, especially whether we're different time zones. I know we always do everything on my time zone. So I want to make sure that I'm taking into account how this will land for you as well. Again, measured at the speaker's, not at the speaker's mouth, but at the other person's ear.
So is there somebody that you kind of look up to as a model for this? And the obvious choices obviously would be your boss and then Kim, but we know that's going to land as flattery to Kim, so we'll just exclude her. Is there anybody else, or maybe somebody who's taken your workshop and just absolutely owned it after that?
This is a great question. I love this question. I will say, and Kim is not a fan of my public praise. So Kim, I won't give you any public praise. I do learn, this is not sucking up to Jason but I learned so much from Jason. And one of the reasons why I really like working for him is because for me, the care personally comes very naturally. Like I don't have to flex that muscle. The challenge directly is hard, not just in the sort of the fear of conflict part, which I've gotten better because, that's how we grow. But for me, I have a lot of ideas. And so Jason has been a very helpful thought partner for me to kind of tease out different ideas and kind of coming, and you have an engineering background. And so he has an MBA, but he also has an engineering background. And so what I have found so helpful with this part, what has been hard for me is using core. What specifically was the thing this person did that was most helpful? And it forces me not to like skip to the end, like, pick up knife, put in peanut butter, put peanut butter on knife, right? But that is very helpful for me to clarify my thinking. And so that has been, for me, I think that he's given me the space because I tend to be someone, I think out loud, I brainstorm a lot. So he gives me space to do that. And then I also can learn from how he can really distill very complex problems into their sort of small pieces. And I find that very, very helpful from a communications perspective. People can only absorb one thing. So that is something I highly value. And I share that because it forces me also to look at, because care personally comes so naturally to me, it also forces me to think about what are the steps that people can do if care personally doesn't come naturally to them, the things that are obvious. Because for each of us, I think one comes a little bit easier than another.
And maybe that's the answer to this last question, but what do you think, what is the one thing you'd like everybody to take away from listening today? What's the one thing? That
better relationships are really just one conversation away. And you can start even just by asking each other, tell me about a time, like what does good feedback look like for you? Or somebody that, who would you appreciate getting feedback from? What is it that they do? Because if we can start to understand what care personally and challenge directly look like for each other, we can start to build more of these candid relationships. And just start by asking.
And ask often.
Yeah.
Because you said conversations, plural.
Exactly. So. Not a one and done.
So, Amy, this has really been great. If people want to learn more about you, about Radical Candor, your podcast, how can they do that? How can they engage with you?
Would love it, Clint. Thank you. Yeah, go to radicalcandor.com. Our podcast, Radical Candor, we'd love for you to listen. We go into great detail wherever you get your podcasts. We actually have a community where people can practice Radical Candor. They can go to community.radicalcandor.com, but maybe .ai. I should know that. And then, you mentioned I did a TEDx talk. So if you want to look me up on YouTube, Amy Sandler, TEDx on YouTube. So lots of free content over on Radical Candor. Start practicing, and it's best to do it with someone else. Like, we don't need to do it in a vacuum. It's about building better relationships.
And the workshops, are they just for companies, or can individuals sign up, and how long do they take?
Great question. We actually have just started offering public workshops. So if you go to our website, you'll see, in fact, we have one coming up. I don't know when you're publishing this. We have one coming up in a couple of weeks, July 14th in 2025, but we'll also have some this fall. So yes, individuals can now get a workshop, but it is also for companies and organizations.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate your time today, Amy. Thank you so much for the conversation.
Thanks, Clint. It's been great.
Thanks for listening to The Conversation. To find out more about Clint, go to clintonmpaget.com and pick up Clint's book, How Teams Triumph, Managing by Commitment, at Amazon. The Conversation with Clinton M. Paget is a production of Forbes Books.